The 1968 Democratic National Convention was held during the height of the Vietnam War, capping off a year of political instability and global violence. Many riots occurred during this time, where the police overstepped their boundaries while trying to contain the demonstrators. The protesters were victim to needless police cruelty. The mayhem at the convention illustrated the rising ability of television to shape public opinion and led to both of the major parties amending how they nominated presidential candidates. The Vietnam War, a fight between communist North Vietnam and anti-communist South Vietnam, took place from 1955 to 1975. Starting in 1965, the United States sent thousands of soldiers and spent billions of dollars to help fight against the North. Americans became increasingly opposed to the U.S. involvement in the war.
I think as the war wore on, more and more people came to the conclusion that it was a misadventure by the United States. It was wrong on a humane level, it was wrong on a political level.
As a result, passionate activists, student groups, and others took to the streets.
At the time of the convention, many anti-war protesters demonstrated on the roads of Chicago. They were met by police who were given the freedom to contain the protesters at all costs, and the situation quickly went south. The confrontations continued to escalate as the police were too vicious in an unnecessary response toward the protesters. The Youth International Party, also known as the Yippies, gathered in Chicago to protest the Vietnam War. Opposition to the war came from ideas that the U.S. should not be in the war and that it was a waste of money, time, and the lives of the young boys who were drafted. Young people were especially upset about this, and that was a large amount of the demonstrators at the convention. The Yippies all shared a common goal to steal the national stage and force the president to bring troops home from Vietnam. Over the course of convention week, mass demonstrations formed, but they were met by large numbers of police.
The police efforts across the street and throughout the city, there were many. Police were chasing demonstrators all through Lincoln Park and all through the streets leading to the convention. There were a lot of cracked heads that were needless, and that was Walker's conclusion, that the police were told to get rid of everybody at whatever cost it took and move them out.
Mayor Richard Daley brought in 12,000 Chicago policemen, 6,000 members of the Illinois National Guard, and 6,000 soldiers from the Army for around 10,000 protesters. In order to protect themselves, police were armed with clubs and multiple rounds of tear gas. In addition, the police superintendent at the time, James B. Conless Jr., authorized the use of the chemical mace to combat the demonstrators. During the days and nights of the convention, there were constant fights between police and protesters camped in both Lincoln and Grant Park. At night, police tried to kick out the protesters from sleeping in the parks at about 11 o'clock. This caused large-scale fights, and there was immense amounts of chaos and violence, causing many injuries. The police's spokesperson justified their actions during the Battle of Michigan Avenue, explaining how the police took proper precautions to preserve law and order. Continuing, he called the Yippies an unruly band of revolutionaries that hate America. Despite the chaos of the riots, the event showed how the anti-Vietnam War movements were gaining traction.
Throughout the many protests and riots that occurred over the span of the convention, the innocent workers of the press were unfairly attacked by police when trying to obtain first-hand reports. Also, the convention signified the start of when the media could shape public opinions and therefore start movements. One of the crucial elements that went into making the convention were the convention anchormen and television networks that were associated and involved. The reporters trying to cover the story, who were outside, were treated violently by the police just as much as the other demonstrators had been.
The journalists who were out on the streets weren't given any privileges and were treated just like the other demonstrators, and some of them got beat up.
They were beaten and injured, they had film taken from them, cameras smashed, and generally stopped from being able to do their job.
Dan Rather, who was a CBS newscaster, being carried out of the convention. That's never happened before, where he was thrown out and physically manhandled. It was unbelievable.
After the first night of protests, The large media networks were very upset about the treatment of their journalists by the police. Editors and executives from CBS, ABC, Newsweek, and all of the other Chicago newspapers, except the Tribune, sent letters to Mayor Daley protesting the beating and intimidating of their workers. Mayor Daley responded by saying that the reporters should follow the instructions of the police and not join in the protest. Daley blamed the reporters for their own injuries, but the police superintendent, Conlisk, promised that the circumstances would improve. However, these changes did not occur. The media on national live TV were not afraid to say their beliefs, which helped to shape people's opinions on who was at fault for the convention violence.
As a result of the Democratic Convention, both major parties in the U.S. amended their ways of selecting candidates, creating improved opportunities for more diverse and younger people to voice their opinions. This was a change for the better because it gave people of all backgrounds a chance to choose their delegates, and it was more reflective on the country's opinion as opposed to what the party bosses thought. Despite the many protests that occurred, the Democrats elected Hubert Humphrey, who was, at the time, vice president to Lyndon B. Johnson. Humphrey shared the same beliefs about the war as President Johnson. Hubert Humphrey lost in the general election to Richard Nixon. There were many factors that contributed to the election loss. One of the main reasons is that the Democratic Party was very divided and people did not trust them.
People will say that the reason that Humphrey lost was the residue that from the convention, that there were too many people who just couldn't bring themselves to overcome their anger and animosity as to what happened in Chicago.
Another thing that contributed to this was the segregationist governor George Wallace took some votes. The 1968 Democratic National Convention had a lasting effect on the American government and politics. The events at the convention caused both the Democratic and Republican parties to adjust the way they selected candidates, becoming more open to outsiders and populists. Not only that, but they also came up with a set of rules giving minority and younger people more power, as well as women.
And those rules mandated that parties have open primaries. That is to say, Mayor Daley couldn't say, you're going to be a delegate, you're going to be a delegate, you're going to be a delegate. They had to go have a real election for delegates, and the party couldn't use its resources behind certain people as opposed to other people. Everybody had to have an open shot at being a delegate. The Democratic Party realized that the old way of running, of electing delegates to the convention was, and controlled delegations.
Inclusive delegates and politicians were also involved, reacting to the comment outside of the convention. On the streets, Senator Abraham Ribicoff attacked the Gestapo tactics, and Daley fired back with insults of his own.
With George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. With George McGovern, we wouldn't have a National Guard.
Mayor Richard Daley's response to the protesters and riots, including the way he handled these situations, destroyed the people's faith in politicians and the political system, dividing the country. It is in psychic impact and its long-term political consequences. It eclipsed any other such convention in American history, destroying faith in politicians, in the political system, in the country, and its institutions. Over time, people became distrustful and suspicious of the government because they did not expect them to do the right thing. After what had happened, the whole country was in a state of anger, confusion, and shock.
Convention Week in 1968 was a week of triumph and tragedy. There was a lot of violence from the police that could have been prevented, and many people got hurt, including demonstrators and reporters. As Haynes Johnson puts it best, the Chicago Convention became a lacerating event, a distillation of a year of heartbreak, assassinations, riots, and a breakdown in law and order that made it seem as if the country were coming apart. On the other hand, there was triumph because it caused both parties to change the way that they elected delegates, making the process more open and letting Americans become more involved in the election process.